Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. Coming up this week, the rider who finished top 10 at the Giro d'Italia despite putting on 5 kilograms during the race. How is that even possible? I'll be looking into the possible causes. I'll also wrap up stage 1 of the Critérium du Dauphiné, plus the Brussels Cycling Classic, Mercan'Tour Classic, Heylen Real Estate Heistse Pijl, and the Vuelta Andalucia Women. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that the roads of the Critérium du Dauphiné are quite fast. (100km/h in a bunch is not for the faint of heart. We also learnt that there are a heap of prototype bikes in the peloton there. Spotted at the Dauphiné was an as-yet unreleased Canyon Air Road ridden by Movistar, a new Trek that says both Imonda and Madon on the top tube, a new Pinarello Dogma for some of the riders at Ineos Grenadiers, and a new paint scheme for Remco Evenepoel with some brand new Roval wheels. And finally, we learnt that Thymen Arensman finished 6th overall at the Giro d'Italia, despite putting on 4 or 5 kilos during the event. This was something he revealed on the Dutch website Indy Ledistru, but you can read all about it in English over our own website, which is globalcyclingnetwork.com. I'll put a link to that in the description just down below. But it seems almost impossible, doesn't it? Gaining weight while riding 3,500 kilometres in 3 weeks. But it does happen. Gianni Moscon said he gained 8 kilos during the 2019 Tour de France, and it happened to me personally at my first Giro d'Italia. Like Arensman, I gained about 5 kilos over the 3 weeks, although unlike Arensman, I didn't manage to finish 6th overall. The Dutchman said that his power numbers were the best he's ever seen, but it's impossible to keep up with the best if you're that much over your race weight. His skin fold measurements were very low, so it certainly wasn't fat, so Arensman put the gain down to retention of water. That's an awful lot of water though. It's effectively like carrying 10 full bidons with you on every single stage. But it's not uncommon in Grand Tours. Sometimes you'll see riders wrapped up in very warm clothing on rest day rides, basically trying to sweat out the excess water from their bodies. Now for me personally, I'd put my own water retention at the Giro down to taking electrolyte tablets. So it's a really hot addition in 2009, and the team doctors recommended we take supplements to replace the electrolytes we'd be losing through sweat. A few years after that, I did a sweat test with our now nutrition partner Precision Fuel and Hydration, and it showed that I don't lose much sodium in my sweat. Sodium binds with water in the body, and so it made sense to me that if I was ingesting more sodium than I was excreting, my excess weight would simply be down to water retention. The same can be said about carbohydrates. So for every gram of stored glycogen, your body stores around 3 to 4 grams of water. Now, we've all heard about how much riders are consuming in races these days, up to 130 grams of carbs per hour versus the 30 to 40 that was recommended when I was racing. And it means that the riders are not at the same levels of glycogen depletion at the end of each stage as we probably were back in my day. But with that, I suppose, there's the risk that you overeat throughout the course of a day, which could be another cause of weight gain through water retention. Jonathan Vaughters of EF made an interesting point when he joined our Giro coverage. He basically said that the riders who are suffering the most to get through the race are the ones most likely to gain weight through water retention. That made a lot of sense in my case. I suffered every day to get through each stage of that Giro. But in Arensman's case, it's not quite the same. Yes, of course, he'd be on his limit on the days where the GC might change, but on the other stages, he'd have got through fairly easily, I would have thought. Now, the science behind that type of weight gain is down to stress. Both physical and psychological stress raise your cortisol levels, which can in turn increase your desire to eat, particularly calorie-rich foods. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean gaining loads of fat, but potentially storing a lot more glycogen that is then bound to water. Now, as one of the most meticulous riders in the peloton when it comes to training and general performance, you can be sure that Arensman and his coaches will figure out how to prevent the same thing happening in future Grand Tours. If he can stay at his race weight, which is around 68 kilos apparently, then he's got a decent shot at a podium in the next couple of years. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this, and if you had your own experience of weight gain despite huge expenditure of calories through cycling. I, and I'm sure many others watching this, would be interested to hear what you did to avoid it happening again. Right, I will move on to some actual racing now, and start with the Critérium du Dauphiné. Roglic, Vlasov, Hindley, Kuss, Evenepoel, Landa, Ayuso, Rodriguez, Gaudu, Jorgensen, Buitrago, Hay, Gegenhardt, Sivakov and Tiberi are amongst a star-studded GC field. With an individual time trial and 3 summit finishes later on this week, is going to give us a real indication of the Tour de France riders' form. It's going to be particularly interesting, given that it's been a while since most of those riders have pinned a number on their back. The first day was the only one of the 8 stages that looked like a nailed-on bunch sprint. As such, there are not that many sprinters in attendance this year. The 2 biggest names who are Mads Pedersen and Sam Bennett, and so it was their teams who controlled things behind a 2-man breakaway for most of the day. Niels Pollitt of UAE made an attack inside the last 20 kilometres, but it didn't really amount to too much. The sprinters teams were not going to let their chance slip away. Now, despite a completely different roster here, Lidl Trek's exemplary lead-outs in the Giro d'Italia continued. Ryan Gibbons was the last man for Pedersen, and he dropped him off to about 150 metres to go. Glued to the Dane's wheel, though, was Sam Bennett. However, once Pedersen kicks, he never really seems to slow down, does he? Bennett tried to come off his wheel, but had to sit back in the saddle before the line and accept defeat. For Pedersen, that was his 8th win of the season so far, and for Lidl Trek, their 24th. You can watch the rest of the race live and on demand on Discovery+, where you'll also be able to watch Stage 1 of the Tour de Suisse this weekend, as well as Dwars Doorhet Hageland, the Women's Tour of Britain, and the Mountain Bike World Series from Leogang, which is also available on Max in the US. Meanwhile, at the Heylen Real Estate Heistse Pijl, Alexander Kristoff took his 4th win of the season and the 92nd of his career. It'd be great to see him get to 100 before he retires, wouldn't it? He beat Casper van Uden on the day in what was a small group sprint. Uno X had yet more success one day later at the Brussels Cycling Classic. 2 ascents of the Muur and 2 of the Bosberg made for a tough day out. And when the going gets tough, Jonas Abrahamsen gets going. The Norwegian attacked with a little under 5k's to go and quite comfortably held off the sprinters to the line. He's been such a solid rider over the last couple of years, but remarkably, that was his first ever pro victory. And going back to the weight gain discussion from earlier on in the show, Abrahamsen is a rider who's gained a lot of weight, but done so deliberately. So early in his career, he was basically trying to be a GC rider. He weighed about 60 kilograms. He's now 80 kilograms and focusing on cobbled classics rather than mountainous stage races. And it's clearly working for him, isn't it? Biniam Girmay and Caden Groves had to settle for 2nd and 3rd respectively, 4 seconds down on the winner. At the women's Vuelta Andalucia, there was a clean sweep of the podium for Lived Alula Jayco, who also won 3 of the 4 stages. Silke Schmulders took her first pro win on day 1, ahead of Mavi Garcia and Ella Wiley, and it was those 3 who filled the top 3 places on the next 2 stages too, sharing out the wins between them. The only non-Liv rider to win a stage was Arlenis Sierra on the final day. There was another win for 20-year-old Lenny Martinez at the Mercan'Tour Classic last week. That was his 5th win of the season, and they've all come in one-day races. He'll be at the Tour de Suisse starting this Sunday. Meanwhile, at Unbound on Saturday, Lachlan Morton took a hugely popular win despite going off course in the men's race, whilst PhD student Rosa Closer took a surprise win in the women's. We'll be going into those races in more detail on tomorrow's GCN show, so keep your eyes out for that. In other news, a couple of nations have now revealed their Olympic Games selections. The most surprising part to me was that the Netherlands have only qualified for 3 spots in the men's road race. The max that any team can have is 4, but I assume that Van der Poel alone would have bagged enough UCI points to give the Dutch the full quota. Anyway, alongside Van der Poel, it will be Dylan van Baarle and Dan Ola who will double up in the time trial, whilst the women's squad is made up of Wiebes, Vollering, Van Dijk and Vos. Quite the team that, but we all know what happened to that same team in Tokyo. And just finally, Miguel Angel Lopez has finally been given an actual suspension by the UCI. The Colombian had been provisionally suspended last summer, but he's now been handed a 4-year ban for use and possession of a prohibited substance before the 2022 Giro d'Italia. That banned substance was a hormone called menotropin. Lopez has maintained his innocence throughout. Right, that is all for this week. I'll be back next Monday with a wrap-up of how the Tour de France GC contenders looked during the Critérium de Dauphiné. I will see you then.